much that is going to, out of that long term, there will be, a new revolution, new uprising, a new reconstruction, you could say, where people realize that hard work and morality, ethics, and things like that actually build sustainable societies. But we're not there yet. Right now, we're in a decadent society, a complacent, apathetic society of grooming children, printing money, where the son of the so-called president who rigged the election, the son, you probably saw this on the weekend, Hunter Biden's got more videos of him, I don't know, weighing out crack cocaine, smoking crack, naked, doing all kinds of hookers or whatever. I haven't actually bothered watching that stuff, so I've seen enough Hunter Biden. I still can't erase some of those images from my mind, and I don't want to put any more in there. I don't want some percentage of my brain to be labeled the Hunter Biden files. It's just too much. I just want to delete that folder, frankly. But it's just an example of where we are. And that's because of easy money printing. That's because of America's ability to coerce and threaten other countries. That's what created Hunter Biden and the Biden crime family. Or Jill Biden, who runs out saying that Hispanics are unique like breakfast tacos. She said that in a speech in San Antonio. That's what you think Latinos are? Girl? Crazy girl? You think they're unique like breakfast tacos? Tacos, really? This is the leadership of America. Thinks that Mexicans are equivalent to breakfast tacos. It's like, she should have worn a sombrero in that speech, I think, just to be fully 100% pandering. Just go for it, Jill. Just make a total fool out of yourself. But back to the practical note here, when all of this happens, and this is a process, it may not happen in one day, but it can happen very rapidly. It can happen over a period of several days, or it might take months to play out. But when it completes, when this runs its course, everything that you buy could be 1,000% more expensive. But I mean, it's just a ballpark guess. My point is that the currency that you have in dollars is going to collapse in value so much that the things you need are going to cost a fortune compared to what they used to cost. And so, who wins in that situation? Who wins? It's people who were preppers, people who stockpiled before the price increase. And so, once again, it comes back to prepping and having food supplies, being able to grow your own food, and converting soon to fail currency into other things like land or physical gold and silver or ammunition, all these things that hold value. Whoever has the goods that hold value, which can also include real estate, residential buildings, commercial buildings, hotels, businesses, factories that produce something real. All of these people are going to win big as most of society loses. And when society loses, people are going to riot. And the riots are already beginning on a global scale. We're watching it in Sri Lanka and many other countries around the world. Dozens of countries are currently experiencing social unrest. That's only going to get worse as the currencies collapse. And, I think Andy Shackman is correct about this, that we're going to wake up one day and the banks will be frozen. And they will say, well, we're going to do what crypto did and just freeze all withdrawals. We've seen that in the crypto space, right, with Celsius and other platforms. You say, well, hey, it doesn't matter how much you have with us, we're freezing withdrawals, we're freezing transfers, and so on. It's just frozen. Banks are going to do that. They're going to say, oh, don't worry, you still have your money. See the digits on these screens? You can log in and view your money. You just can't have it. You can't take it out. You can't use it. You can't go to the ATM and get cash for it. You can't transfer it. Yeah, it's still your money. You just can't access it. So, is it really yours at all if you can't use it? No, of course it isn't. It's the banks. That's a bail-in scenario. That's what crypto is doing right now, and that's what traditional banks are going to be doing more and more. And that gets us to China, because that's exactly what's happening in China right now. They have halted withdrawals from some of these banks. So over the weekend, Reuters was reporting that Sunday in the city of Zhengzhou, and many were injured as they were taken away amid the freezing of their deposits by some rural-based banks. The banks froze millions of dollars worth of deposits in April, telling customers they were upgrading their internal systems. Remember that? I mentioned that back in, I think, May. Yeah, they're saying it's an upgrade. Kind of like the Microsoft blue screen of death upgrade, where it says, don't turn off your computer. We have to update your operating system. 1% completed. You're trying to make it to the airport or something. and the update takes forever. Well, that's what the bank said. But it went on for months. So it says, according to Chinese media, the frozen deposits could be worth up to $1.5 billion, and there are 3 banks that are being investigated. About 1,000 people gathered outside the Zhengzhou branch of China's central bank on Sunday to demand action. This is in the Henan province, southwest of Beijing. Depositors were waving banners and throwing plastic bottles at security guards and so on and so forth. The police then announced to the protesters from a vehicle that they were an illegal assembly and would be detained and fined if they didn't leave. Okay, you got that? So, welcome to communism. You deposit your money in the bank that is regulated by the state. The bank steals all your money, gives you some BS story, like, oh, we're doing a system upgrade. Really? No, you're stealing everybody's money. And then when you protest that, the state sends out police to threaten you with arrest. Uh-huh. Does that sound like America these days, too? You try to protest something being stolen, like an election, and what happens? You get arrested, and you become a political prisoner. You get thrown in the gulag. China and the United States are both communists under these left-wing regimes. Now, the U.S. wouldn't be communist if Trump were in office right now because he won the election. But under the Biden regime, remember, Biden works for China, so the U.S. has become just an extension of communist China. That's why there are so many similarities between the two countries. Now, Jennifer Zhang, who I interviewed before, she tweeted out, "This is huge. Don't know how this will end. Henan Bank is not the only one that's having problems with liquidity. All 4 Chinese banks are having the same issue. Some depositors found they can save and cannot withdraw money with their bank cards." So, in other words, there's a China bank contagion that's taking place. It's not just some small, little, minor, rural, fringe banks. This is the major banks of China. They're having a liquidity crisis in the same way that crypto is having a crisis. There's too much leverage in the system, too much debt, and not enough assets to meet the demands of depositors who want some of their assets back out. And so, you see, the banking system in China is a Ponzi scheme. So is a lot of crypto. A lot of crypto is just a Ponzi scheme. Dogecoin and so on. A lot of U.S. banks are really Ponzi schemes that are just supported by the state. When granted permission to engage in fractional reserve banking, which is a Ponzi type of structure, by the way. And it's backed by the FDIC, which is just Ponzi insurance. That will quickly run out of money when contagion spreads. So what we really could be looking at here is global contagion, where Chinese banks fail, and then that spreads to European banks or Japan, and then that spreads to the United States and other Western nations, Australia, Canada, and so on. We're looking at a global toppling of the debt-based economic system. Let's call it the leverage world order. Instead of liberal world order, it's the leverage world order, and it's coming down. And when it does come down, once again, what has value? All the hard assets that we covered every time. Land, gold, silver, and all that. And by the way, I got the chance over the last few days to meet some listeners of this podcast who are in the Midwest, where I was traveling through. And although I didn't have much time to talk with them, I wish I could have had more time. They are 100% on board with what we're talking about here, and they are preparing in assets working to get into hard assets, ready to survival is coming. They understand that food shortages are beginning, food inflation is real, diesel fuel, all these things. They see the food facilities being burned down. They see the explosions at the energy plants and so on. And they were sharing with me exactly what they're doing. And also, in some cases, asking for my advice on what they should do next. So, I just want to tell you, if you're listening to this and you feel alone in your social circle or in your family because you're the only one that's informed about what's happening in the world, or you're the only one that's taking steps, have no illusion, you are not alone at all. You are one of many, a massive group of people who are well aware of this and who are getting informed and getting prepared on a scale that you just can't believe. And I'll tell you this, and I don't say this to brag at all. Everywhere I go, I meet people who listen to this podcast. Everywhere I go, people see me, they say hello, they tell me they love what we're doing here, and they start sharing with me some of what they're doing. And the reason that they're able to do that is because they have this instant trust, because they know me, they've been listening to my podcast for a long time, they know that I share information, it's pretty personal about preparedness and so on. So they know that they can share right back with me, and they tell me about the things that
one of those theories is that the pharaoh Akhenaten, who created monotheism, is in fact represented in the Bible as the figure Moses. Moses is a mythical figure. The Exodus is pure mythology. But there really was a pharaoh named Akhenaten. He destroyed all the idols in Egypt and replaced them with the worship of his god Aten, who was the sun. And he said that the sun is the only one god. The sun in Egypt was referred to as the one, and Ra was referred to as the one, and the God of Israel is referred to as the one. So many scholars and others have concluded that the monotheism of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam were in fact derived from this pharaoh Akhenaten and from his worship of the god Aten, who is the sun. You can see Akhenaten seated on the left below the sun, the rays of the sun are reaching down to the earth. On the right is his wife Nefertiti, who is also thought to be his sister, and his children are in their laps. And one of those children became the pharaoh Tutankhamun. Again, that god Aten became the god Yahweh in Judaism. Akhenaten, who was a real historical figure, became the mythical Moses. His wife and sister became Moses' sister Miriam, and their child became Tutankhamun, or Jesus. The Quran fits with this theory very well, because the Quran posits that Jesus was the son of Miriam. Miriam is a variant of the name Mary, and in the Quran she's named Miriam, Jesus is named Isa. And Miriam's brother was Moses and Aaron. And the Quran is very explicitly states that Jesus' mother was Miriam, who was the sister of Aaron and Moses, and the daughter of Amram, whom the Quran calls Imran. This theory is set forth in books by Ahmed Aswan. Sigmund Freud had initially said that Akhenaten was the father of Jewish monotheism, and that he had a high priest, and that high priest became the character Moses in the Old Testament. Ahmad Asman goes further and states that Moses was in fact based upon this pharaoh Akhenaten. son, Tutankhamun, became the archetype and the prototype and the typology of the New Testament for Jesus. And again, this fits very nicely with the Quran, which states that Jesus was the son of Moses' sister Mary. And so that would fit with Nefertiti being the sister of Akhenaten and giving birth to Tutankhamun. In my book, Satanic Secrets of Jesus Christ, I give what I believe to be the more authentic, true history behind the evolution of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and they actually relate to more ancient gods than the god Atu, which was created by Akhenaten, and the original Egyptian gods incorporated the god Shesmu. Shesmu was a butcher for the god Unas, and Shesmu would slay the other gods and slay human beings and feed their flesh and souls and blood to his master god Unas, who would then absorb all of that energy and the magical powers of the souls of the gods and of human beings. And this process is described in Egyptian mythology as harvesting the grapes and then treading upon them in the winepress, which extracts the blood of the grapes and which stains the clothing of the god Shesmu, and of the winepress stains it red like blood. The book Egyptian Mythology A to Z by Pat Remler describes this god, Shesmu, and states, best known as the god of the winepress, Shesmu has a complex personality. From the pyramid text of Unas, we learn of his generous nature. He offers grape juice to Unas, with which to make wine in the next world, and he ferociously attacks the enemies of Unas. He casts wickedness on him that is wicked, and truth upon he who follows truth. I believe that Jesus Christ is based upon this God that has two personalities, Shesmu, in Egyptian mythology. Jesus saves the righteous and stomps out the wicked in his winepress in the exact same fashion that Shesmu had. And Jesus becomes the advocate of Israel and smites all of Israel's enemies when he returns as the Antichrist. So Jesus has this same complex dual personality. Initially, he comes as the salvation of the nations, to save the righteous of the nations, but then he flips and becomes the advocate of Israel and the smiting stone, the stumbling stone, and the avenging sword of Israel that betrays the nations and ruins them. The article from Egyptian Mythology A to Z continues. Shesmu directs the pressing of grapes and oils of all kinds, including olive, pine, castor, almond, and oil from the seeds of the moringa tree, which grows in the desert and is quite rare. Oil from the moringa tree was used for making perfume, and Shesmu also became the god of perfume and sacred oils used in temple rituals and embalming. Remember that Mary anointed Jesus' feet with precious, expensive perfume, and with her tears. And this represents the god Shesmu, who treads on the winepress with his feet. And that is what Jesus does. Jesus is the Messiah who was anointed for war, and he was anointed not to become the king of the Jews, but he was anointed as part of his embalming process because he was about to die. Egyptian mythology interchanges the idea of red wine and blood. That's also true of Christianity, where Jesus says that the Eucharist, the wine in the cup of God's wrath, is his blood. It was the color rather than the actual substance that was important to the Egyptians. When Shezmu is portrayed as a friend of the dead, he offers them wine to ease their journey to the netherworld. Jesus is the God of the dead. He shuns life on earth and promises an afterlife in an eternal heavenly kingdom. All of this mirrors Egyptian mythology, where they believe that chaos and death are fought off through embalming and anointing with perfume that brings one into the afterlife. At the same time, he is linked with Apep, a terrible demon of the underworld, and is shown tossing the heads of enemies into his winepress to extract the blood as if it were grape juice. Jesus has this same dual nature. Apep is the serpent of chaos, and Jesus is also the serpent of chaos hanging on the cross, and the cross represents the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And Jesus is the serpent hanging on that tree, tempting mankind to consume the gnosis of his knowledge, in the same sense that Adam and Eve consumed the gnosis that the serpent offered them from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For the Egyptians, red wine was synonymous with blood. Same is true of the Christians. And blood is synonymous in Judaism with the soul. In the cannibal hand, Shezmu helps us gain power in the next world. Jesus helps Yahweh gain power by extracting the souls of the nations and giving those souls to Israel. Behold, Shezmu has cut them off from Unas. Unas is the equivalent of Yahweh. Shezmu is the equivalent of Jesus Christ. He has boiled pieces of them in his blazing cauldrons. Unas has eaten their words of power. He has eaten their spirits. This is what Jesus does as the scapegoat, the sacrificial goat of Israel. He calls upon all Christians to bear the same cross that he bears, and therefore become human sacrifices to Unas, just as he was a human sacrifice to Unas. And that enables Yahweh to extract all the souls of the nation, the soul of Yahida and the soul of Mashiach Yahida, and to transfer those to Israel and to the Messiah, son of David, King David, over Israel. The Book of the Dead tells us that one of Shezmu's title is Lord of the Blood. And in chapter 175, Osiris commands that Shezmu dismember the evil ones and place their heads in a winepress to be pressed like grapes and create wine. All of this same imagery is repeated both in the prophet Isaiah chapter 63 and in the book of Revelations in the New Testament, chapter 19, as I'll show you. Most often, Shezmu appears as a lion-headed or hawk-headed man with a uraeus on his head. His main cult center was in Fayum, but he was also worshipped at Edfu and Dendera, where he is shown on temple walls, traveling in a silver boat wearing a uraeus and 2 stars on his head. Shezmu is linked with Re, the setting sun for the red color. Apep, the evil god of the underworld and enemy of Re. Hereshef, who shares his title Lord of the Blood. Horus, who, when he assumes the head of a falcon. Thoth is the god of wisdom, and Nefertu is a god of perfume. So Jesus Christ is the God of wisdom in that he is the serpent hanging from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He is the God of chaos. Chaos is feminine. Chaos is wisdom. The female aspect of Jesus Christ is Sophia, which is Greek for wisdom. And Jesus himself, as the male aspect, is Gnosis, which is knowledge as in the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Jesus is Apep, the serpentine god of chaos and the battles with the serpent of light, which is Re or Yahweh. Eventually, the two serpents combine as one serpent, which is represented in the figure of the caduceus, and we see that in the crucifixion of Christ, where he has two figures on either side when he is crucified, and those two figures are then unified in the Christ figure as the caduceus, and so there are many correspondences between this butcher god Shezmu and the butcher god Jesus Christ. When he wore the apex crown, a tall crown of Upper Egypt with ostrich plumes, he was affiliated with Cyrus, the god of the underworld. One of his titles is Lord of Blood, and in this role, Harishef is linked with Shezmu, a god with dual personality. And that dual personality manifests itself in Jesus Christ, who is both the Christ and the Antichrist. He returns as the Antichrist to tread the winepress and to stomp on the heads of all the nations for the benefit of Israel. He is killed in these battles of the nations and then transfers his soul over to Messiah, son of David, so that King David can rule in peace from Jerusalem. Jesus rules from Rome, from the nations, in the same sense that Joseph had ruled in Egypt behind the throne of the Pharaoh. So Jesus is referred to as the Messiah, son of Joseph, and he will wage all these wars and spill all of these oceans of blood, and will die himself and then transfer his higher soul of chaos, the soul of Apep, the serpent of chaos, who battles with the sun, the god Re, every night, and every day becomes a new day of creation. And ultimately, these two serpents intertwine with one another and become unified when the world and the universe are rectified in the world to come. And in its article on wine, Egyptian mythology A to Z states, in ancient Egypt, wine was reserved for the king's court and the wealthy. Because it was so costly, jars of wine were a worthy offering to the gods. The goddess Hathor was known for her love of wine, and on her festival days, everyone who could drank wine. The pyramid texts of Unas tell us that Shezmu, god of the winepress, gave Unas a vat of grape juice with which to make wine in the next world. Muchapu, in his book Wine and Wine Offering in the Religion of Ancient Egypt, wrote about wine and Shezmu. In the pyramid texts, the winepress god Shezmu assumes two different roles. In his original role, he is responsible for the bringing of wine. Shezmu comes to you, O Osiris, bearing wine. Due to the special nature of the winepress, which presses out the juice of the grapes and thus exhibits a destructive power, Shezmu became associated with the image of a slaughterer. Thus, it is Shezmu who cuts them, i.e. those that are hostile to the king, up for the king. The same image appears in the coffin texts and in the Book of the Dead. A more explicit statement, the coffin text version of the above-quoted pyramid text further indicates the identity of Shezmu as a slaughterer. It is Shezmu, red of timbers, i.e. the poles of the winepress, which were stained with red grape juice, who slaughters them for me. Coffin text 6:179. Thus the red color of the juice of the grapes was likened to blood. The image of Shezmu as slaughterer is vividly portrayed in two illustrated papyri from the New Kingdom. There, human heads are shown placed in the winepress, while blood is dripping out of the sack. The Egyptians used to fill a sack with bunches of grapes and then twist it like wringing on a towel to extract the grape juice, which was first pressed by human feet. heads are likened to grapes in the sack, where their blood was likened to grape juice. This image of the crushing of grapes in the process of winemaking may not have been unique in the ancient imagination, as a passage in the Old Testament attests. I had trodden the winepress alone, I trod them, i.e. people who sinned against God, in my anger, and I trampled them in my wrath. Their lifeblood is sprinkled on my garments, and I have stained all my raiment. Isaiah chapter 63, verse 3. Evidently, Muchapu did not realize that this figure was copied from Shezmun and represents the Messiah, son of Joseph, the Messiah anointed for war, Jesus Christ, who returns as the Antichrist and smites all of the nations and exterminates the nations so that Israel alone survives in the world to come. Furthermore, grape juice is once referred to in Ugaritic literature as the blood of the grapes. In my book, Satanic Secrets of Jesus Christ, I pointed all of this out, and I identified Jesus as Shezmun, both in the form of Christ and in the form of the Antichrist. Jesus treads the winepress. His blood is the Eucharist, and he feeds the blood and the souls of the nations to Yahweh and transfers their souls, their higher soul of chaos, of Yehidah, to Israel. Jesus' blood fills the cup of God's wrath. The cup of God's wrath contains the poison which exterminates the nations for the benefit of his chosen people, the Israelites. The full reference in Isaiah to the Messiah, son of Joseph, treading the winepress, states, "Who is this coming from Edom?" Edom is associated with the nations. "From Bozrah, with his garments stained crimson red. Who is this robed in splendor, striding forward in the greatness of his strength? It is I, proclaiming victory, mighty to save." That is the Messiah, son of Joseph, who in the New Testament is represented as Jesus Christ. "Why are your garments red, like those of one treading the winepress? I have trodden the winepress alone, from the nations no one was with me. I trampled them in my anger, and trod them down in my wrath. Their blood spattered my garments, and I stained all my clothing. It was for me the day of vengeance, the year for me to redeem had come. I looked, but there was no one to help. I was appalled that no one gave support. So my own arm achieved salvation for me, and my own wrath sustained me. I trampled the nations in my anger. In my wrath I made them drunk and poured their blood on the ground." Drunkenness and intoxication from wine is equated to chaos, and the Egyptians viewed wine as a means of staving off chaos. The human lifespan was equated to the lifespan of creation, in which there is initially order, but order gives way and battles with chaos, which triumphs eventually over order. And the human body eventually ages, dies, and then decays. So the Egyptians utilized wine in their embalming rituals and in their worship of their gods as a method of staving off chaos. And wine is equated with chaos because intoxication produces a disorderly and chaotic mind in the intoxicated. The Greeks, in their god Dionysus, who is equated with Shezmun, took an opposite view, and they viewed the intoxication of drunkenness as freedom from order of the law and as a celebration of life, instead of representing death and decay, which is the way that the Egyptians viewed it. The book of Revelation reveals the fact that this figure, who was presented in Isaiah chapter 63, becomes Christ and slaughter all the nations for the benefit of Israel. Another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Still another angel, who had charge of the fire, came from the altar and called in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, "Take your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of grapes from the earth's vine, because its grapes are ripe." The angel swung his sickle on the earth, gathered its grapes, and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. They were trampled in the winepress outside the city, and blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as the horses' bridles, for a distance of 1,600 stadia. Coming out of his mouth is a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations. He will rule them with an iron scepter. He treads the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God Almighty. The fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is grapes. The tree itself is a grapevine. That fruit was initially unripe when Adam and Eve consumed it. It is Jesus' role in his 2,000-year reign in the age of Pisces, which is represented by those two serpents, those two leviathans, the two fish of Pisces. It is his role to create a vast empire and to slay all the other gods in the same way that Shezim slayed all the other gods and fed the souls of those gods to his master god, Yahweh, so that that master god could assimilate all the energy of those souls and assimilate their magical powers. Jesus accomplishes the same tasks for Yahweh by slaying all the pagan gods and ultimately by returning as the Antichrist to completely exterminate all the heathen pagans of the nations who have worshipped Jesus. Jesus is a deceitful figure who presents himself as the salvation of the nations when he is in fact the salvation of Israel. The Book of the Dead in the papyrus of Ani writes about Unas and Shezmo. Who then is this? It is Aneth, the god who breathed his arm. As concerning the words, and again remember that arm in Isaiah 63. As concerning the words, that night of the reckoning of destruction, it is the night of the burning of the dam and the overthrow of the wicked and the sacred block and the slaughter of souls. Who then is this? It is Memu, the headsman of Osiris. That Memu is Shezmo. It is Apep, when he upriseth up with one head bearing Maat. Maat is order. Here it is represented as right and truth. Upon it, or as others say, it is Horus, when he rises up with two heads, whereof the one beareth Maat, and the other wickedness. This is again the two-headed serpent, which is Jesus Christ and his opposition, the Messiah, son of David. The two of them form the body and soul of the ultimate Messiah, son of David, after Jesus Christ dies and renders his soul unto Messiah, son of David. So this is all derived from the Egyptian belief that there are two serpents, the serpent of light and the serpent of darkness. And Jesus is the serpent of darkness hanging on the cross, which is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He bestoweth wickedness on him that worketh wickedness, and Maat, which is order, on him that followeth after righteousness and truth. Whereas others say, it is the great Horus who dwelleth in Shechem, whereas others say it is Toph, whereas others say it is Nefertiti or Sept, who doth thwart the course of the foes of never sure. So again, Jesus has this will establish order by destroying the wicked nations, and he will die in that process, and then the heir to King David's throne will then be able to live in peace. You can see in the illustration Shezmun bearing two knives, having a lion's head or a falcon's head, and he is the butcher for the god Unas. Part of the hieroglyphics for Shezmun's name is the wine press itself, and you can see that. Here he's called Menmu, but it's actually Shezmun, and this is from the papyrus in the Book of the Dead. As concerning night, that of the reckoning of the destroying goddess, the night it is of the burning up of the enemies, and of causing the destruction of the wicked and his block, and of the slaughter of souls. Who then is it? Menmu, which is Shezmun. It is the slaughterer of Osiris, otherwise said Apep, who is the serpent of chaos, who battles with Ra at night, when Ra sails through the cosmos on his boat, and his ally Horus helps him battle Apep, the serpent of chaos, so that a new day of creation can arise at the dawn. When he riseth up with one head, having upon it Me'at, which is order, they are imposing order upon chaos, and that order is what preserves life. Otherwise said, Horus it is when he riseth up with two heads, one having Me'at, and the other having wickedness. He giveth wickedness to the worker thereof, and Me'at order to him that followeth after it. Otherwise said, Horus is it the great president of Sechem, otherwise said Toph it is, otherwise said Nephitmu it is, or Septu, forwarding the business of the enemies of never change. Deliver thou from those watchers who bring slaughtering knives, and are provided with fingers cruel and slay those who are in the following of Osiris. So Jesus has this dual nature of saving the righteous and slaughtering the wicked. The wicked are the nations, and the righteous are Israel. In his introduction to Ernest Alfred Wallace Budge's translation of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, John Norman wrote, "The recital of this chapter enabled the deceased to avoid the terrible block of slaughter of the god Osiris, a figure of which is given in the vignette. From the book Am-Tust and the Book of Dates, as well as from the Book of the Dead, we learn that to certain gods was assigned the duty of destroying the dead and consuming their bodies. Some were cast into a lake of liquid fire or burning water, and others were first cut into pieces and then burned. Each of the gods who cut the dead in pieces was provided with a block, and they performed their terrible work under the direction of the headsman of Osiris, whose name was Shezmun." And there you can see the hieroglyphic for Shezmun includes a picture of the wine press. As the name is written in the pyramid texts, the slaughter of the wicked and the cutting up of their bodies were performed nightly, soon after Osiris had completed the judgment of those who had entered the hall of Me'ati. This again all relates to Jesus' role as the treader of the winepress who slaughters the nations for the benefit of Israel. Plutarch wrote about the Egyptians' practices in his book on Isis and Osiris, found in the Moralia, Volume 5, published by Harvard University Press, where Plutarch stated, "The beginning of their drinking dates from the reign of Psammetichus. Before that, they did not drink wine nor use it in libation as something dear to the gods, thinking it to be the blood of those who had once battled against the gods, and from whom, when they had fallen and had become commingled with the earth, they believed vines to have sprung." So the Egyptians believed that grapevines were derived from the blood of those who had fallen when they were battling against the gods. So wine has a very pejorative, negative image in Egyptian mythology, as it does was in Judaism. But among the Greeks, the god Shesnu flips and becomes the god Dionysus, who celebrates with wine and is also the god of the vine. This is the reason why drunkenness drives men out of their senses and crazes them, inasmuch as they are then filled with the blood of their forebears. These tales Eudoxus says in the second book of his World Travels are thus related by the priests. Those priests were the Egyptian priests. So we see that the Egyptians had the polar opposite view of wine and intoxication that the Romans did. And the Egyptians believed that they could stave off chaos and preserve the order of life through the use of wine. The Romans, on the other hand, celebrated wine as a form of becoming chaotic and becoming intoxicated and celebrating the joy of life. So the Romans viewed disorder as a celebration of order. The Egyptians viewed intoxication and the chaos that wine induces as the triumph of the serpent Apep and the triumph of chaos, which brings death and decay and the breaking down of the order of life into death, which the Egyptians thought they could stave off through embalming and through the rituals of the Book of the Dead, which would enable a soul to survive into the afterlife and have a body in the afterlife through maintaining the order of life and not succumbing to the chaos of death. The cannibal hymn from the pyramid texts provides many of the correspondences between Judaism, Christianity, and the Egyptian mythology which Judaism and Christianity copy. The sky pours water, the stars darken, the bulls rush above, and the bones of the earth gods tremble. They are still, the Pleiades, when they see Venus, which is Uranus, appearing animated, as a god who lives on his fathers and feeds on his mothers. So the god Uranus kills all the other gods in the same sense that Yahweh is a jealous God, and Jesus was brought forth to subvert the nations and lead them to destroy their own pagan gods. So in the same way that Judaism feeds off the pagan gods, Uranus feeds off his mothers and fathers and the other gods of the Egyptians. Uranus is the Lord of wisdom, whose mother knows not his name. This is similar to the Gnostic mythology of Barbelo creating the god Yothaboloth, and Yothaboloth being unaware of his mother Sophia or Barbelo, who is wisdom, who created him. The glory of Venus, which is Uranus, is in the sky. His power is in the horizon. Like Atum, his father, who begat him, when he begat Uranus, he, Venus, was mightier than he. This is reflected in the Greek myths. The Greeks also copied these same myths from the Egyptians and learned them from Egyptian priests. And we see in Greek mythology that the god Kronos castrates his father Uranus so that he can beget no more children. And then Zeus defeats his father Kronos. So this same process of the son slaying his father is copied in the Greek myths and in the mythology of Oedipus, which Sigmund Freud found so intriguing. The cause of Venus are about him. His attributes are under his feet. His gods are upon him. His uraei are on his brow. The guiding serpent of Venus is on his forehead, and his soul beholds the serpent of flame. Also bear in mind that the pharaohs bore a serpent on their forehead. That became the tefillin in Judaism, where they have a little black box on their foreheads. All of that is copied from the pharaohs. The powers of Venus protect him. Venus is the bull of the sky, who conquers according to his desire, who lives on the being of every god. Yahweh lives on the being of every god, souls of the nations. He feasts on those other gods by destroying the pagan gods, by tricking the nations into abandoning their own gods and worshiping Jesus, who is Shezman, who then captures their souls when they worship him and feeds those souls to Yahweh, who then transfers them to Israel. The nations are represented by Esau in the Old Testament, and the Israelites are represented by Jacob. Esau surrenders his birthrights and blessings to Jacob, who tricks Esau out of that birthright and blessings. And ultimately, the birthright and blessings are the souls of the peoples of the nations. And the Israelites have tricked the nations into surrendering their souls to Shezman, who then feeds them to Yahweh, who then assigns them to the Israelites. And ultimately, Shezman's soul, the soul of Messiah, son of Joseph, is given up and then enters the body of Messiah, son of David, and becomes the unified Messiah. The two serpents wrapped about each other in the caduceus, which signifies the ultimate Messiah, the unification of the serpent of darkness and serpent of light, becoming one androgynous being, in the same sense that Adam was initially androgynous. Adam and Eve, the two serpents, are also androgynous and have to be restored to one form. And the God of Israel is also androgynous. Its male aspect is Yahweh, and its female aspect is Shekinah, who is the Canaanite goddess of Shekinah, who is the goddess of chaos and wisdom. Who eats their entrails, who comes when their belly is filled with magic. He wants to eat them and eat their guts when their belly is filled with magic, so that Uras can absorb all the magic of the spirit and the soul of the other gods. And the same thing is done with the nations. Their spirit and soul is consumed by Christ when he returns as the Antichrist and slays all of them for Yahweh, who then absorbs all of their soul and magic. From the island of fire, Unas is equipped, his spirits are united. Unas appears as the Great One, Lord of divine helpers. Again, Yahweh is referred to as the Great One in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and 1, the Shema that Israelites utter as their prayer, where they call Yahweh the Holy One. And the sun and Ra were also referred to as the One in Egyptian mythology. That one becomes the monad of Platonic philosophy and philosophy of the Greek philosopher Parmenides, which the Alexandrian Jews incorporated into Judaism as the Holy One. He sits with his back to Geb. It is Linus who judges with him whose name is hidden in this day of slaying the oldest one. That is Jesus in the final judgment, returning as the Antichrist to slay all the nations and exterminate them from the earth, so that Israel can live in the messianic era of peace in the world to come. Linus is the Lord of food offering, who knocks the cord, who himself prepares his meals. It is Linus who eats men and lives on gods, Lord of porters who dispatches messages. It is grasper of horns, who is in, who lassoes them for Linus. It is the serpent, he whose head is raised, who watches them for him, and who drives them to him. It is he who is upon the willows, who binds them for him. It is the wanderer who slaughters the lords, who strangles them for Linus. This is all Shezman. This is Jesus Christ, who has deceived the nations and tricked them into becoming Christians and giving up their souls to Yahweh, who consumes them. He cuts out their intestines for him. He is the messenger whom he sends to punish. It is he of the winepress. Remember, Jesus is the God of the winepress. He cuts them up for Wenus, cooking for him a portion of them in his evening cooking pots. It is Wenus who eats their magic and swallows their spirits. Their great ones are for his morning portion. Their mid-sized ones are for his evening portions. Their little ones are for his night portion. Their old men and old women are for his incense burning. It is the great ones who are in the north of the sky who place for him the fire to the kettles containing them with the thighs of their oldest ones. Those who are in the sky serve Wenus. The cooking pots are wiped off for him with the legs of their women. He has gone around the two complete skies. He has encircled the two regions. Wenus is the great mighty one who has power over the mighty ones. Wenus is the figure of a god who endows with divinity the great figures of the gods. It's important to remember in all this that this is the very oldest form of Egyptian worship of the gods, and by thousands of years predates Akhenaten and his conception of Aten as the Holy One, as the God of the Sun, who has destroyed all the idols and false gods. I believe the god Aten is the ultimate fulfillment of the god Wenus when the other gods have been slaughtered. Him whom he finds in his way, him he devours for himself quite raw. The protection of Wenus is before all the loving ones who are in the horizon. Wenus is a god, older than the oldest. Thousands serve him. Hundreds offer to him. Human sacrifices are given to Wenus. A warrant of appointment as great mighty one is given to him by Orion, father of the gods. Wenus has reappeared in the sky. He is crowned as Lord of the horizon. He has smashed the vertebrae and the spinal marrows. He has taken the hearts of the gods. He has eaten the red crown. He has swallowed the green one. Wenus feeds on the lungs of the wise ones. He is satisfied by living on hearts and their magic. Wenus rejoices that he devours those which are in the red crown. Wenus flourishes. Their magic is in his belly. The dignities of Wenus are not taken from him. He has swallowed the intelligence of every god. The lifetime of Wenus is eternity. His limit is everlastingness. In this, his dignity of if he wishes, he does. If he wishes not, he does not. Recall that Yahweh is the arrogant God who wants to control everything in the universe. Who is within the boundary of the horizon forever and ever? Lo, their soul is in the belly of Wenus. Their spirits are with Wenus. Again, Wenus is the god Unas, the master god of Shezmo, who is his butcher. His surplus of food is more than that of the gods, being cooked for Wenus with their bones. It is Shezmo who cooks them in his cooking pots for Unas. Lo, their soul is with Wenus. Their shadows are with their companions. Wenus is with this which appears, which appears, which hides, which hides. The doers of evil deeds have not power over the hacking up of the earth. The favorite place of Wenus is with those who live on this earth forever and ever. That will be the Israelites in the world to come. I'm going to show you the commentary and notes incorporated into this book very briefly. If you would like, you can pause the video and read them. So Jesus is the God of the wine press. Jesus is the Egyptian god Shezmo. Jesus is the grapevine, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. His fruit is knowledge. That knowledge is unripe for the first 6 days of creation, 6,000 years from Adam until Jesus returns, when the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil is ripe. his descendant Tubal Cain inherited the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, but it was still unripe, and they utilized it to create arms and armor made from metals. Jesus returned as the serpent from the Garden of Eden, hung on the cross as the serpent hung in the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is the grapevine. Jesus offers up the unripe fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the form of his blood, which is wine, which Christians consume in the cup of God's wrath. That cup of God's wrath bears the serpent Apep, who is chaos. It promotes intoxication, which befuddles the minds of the nations and leads them to worship the Christ. The Christ returns as the Antichrist to tread the winepress and stain his clothing with the blood of all the nations until their blood flows deep enough to rise up to the level of a horse's bridle. That knowledge has become right and has provided biological weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons of mass destruction, and chemical weapons of mass destruction, which will enable the nations to devour themselves in the same sense that they devoured their own pagan gods and instead worshipped Shezmu in the form of Jesus Christ. In that way, they lost all of their supernatural protection and came to worship the serpent Satan, who is Jesus Christ, and who will ultimately exterminate all. If you would like to learn more about Shezmu, the Egyptian god of the winepress, and how he correlates to Jesus as both the Christ and the Antichrist, you can find my book, Satanic Secrets of Jesus Christ, Volume 2, Jesus is Satan, on my website at cjbbooks.com. Shezmu is the Egyptian god who slays all the other gods and wicked human beings and feeds their blood and their souls and their magic powers to his master god, Unas. He corresponds in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam to Yahweh and Isa, or Jesus, who is both the Christ and the Antichrist. He has a dual personality in the same sense that Jesus has a dual personality, being both the Christ and the Antichrist. All of this mythology was derived by copying the Egyptian gods, Unas and Shezmu. We are in grave peril in the present era as religious persons call for the end times and want to fulfill their eschatological prophecies. I believe it is very important for us to understand the roots of all of these horrific mythologies and what those beliefs portend for humanity if we do not expose their ultimate source and their ultimate quest, which is to destroy the nations and kill off humanity with the ripened fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is given to humanity by Satan in these mythologies. We are in grave peril that there are people who believe in this 6,000-year-old mythology that Shezmu will come and trample the winepress and stomp on the heads of all wicked human beings, which represents all the nations in whose Abrahamic faith, and will kill us all off. And I hope you appreciate the gravity of the situation, where these beliefs came from, and where we are headed if we do not defend ourselves from these horrific ancient mythologies, which were not handed down to us by the gods, but instead by the Egyptians who invented these mythologies. Please visit my website, cjbbooks.com. Please educate yourself. It is the best way that we can defend
sitting down having lunch, waiting for the food to come, I figured I'd grab a town. Sit down, have a look. There's one particular to my strategy that's absolutely necessary. I'm not actually competing. I've probably seen the title of this video that, yeah, I'm in the competition server, but I'm not actually competing. I'll probably stumble into an epic. By the looks of it, I'm holding, I'll get pretty close to the top 1200, and I've got a bit of a strategy to get myself into that top 1200. Hopefully by the end of the night. I've only got like, I don't know, maybe an hour of playtime before I gotta get to bed. Just moving this game over from my phone to my computer took me 3 attempts to log in. I got the white screen of death, and then I got the 60% freeze twice. So if you're unaware, I thought I'd go with the strategy. I was using, me and my girlfriend were both going to attempt to do the land rush at the same time. Hopefully one of us was going to be able to get in. We tried 2 different strategies to get past the impossible hurdle of actually loading into the land rush in an appropriate manner. So we thought we tried 2 different strategies. One was just let the timer run out, which historically has been pretty unsuccessful, but we cleared our caches and started a new browser and all that. And we tried that on her phone. It's completely unsuccessful. On my phone, can't do it on my computer because for whatever reason, my gaming computer takes a good 5 minutes to load into Town Start. So on my phone, my brand new S21, we tried, let's see, hers let the timer run out. On mine, I think I let the timer run out as well, and then I refreshed, but I refreshed instantly. We thought maybe we'd just give hers the benefit of the doubt, and maybe it just takes really long, but we wanted to give it the opportunity and not do the refresh in case it was going to load in as we're doing the refresh. We might have, cut our own hands off there. So I did the refresh immediately once I noticed I'm pretty sure it was going to load in. Refresh, stuff froze at 60% again. By the time we got in, there was nothing whatsoever. When I was sitting on the bench, it looked like somebody had abandoned the spot, so I took it. Let's talk a little bit about this layout here. I'm going to get into a little bit at the end of this video, get into a little bit of my little hypothetical that I've been kind of mulling around with for a while, but let's get into a little bit about the strategy of this game. My game that I've got going here, so this is totally half-assed. Typically, I would have put my residential where I felt like my residential is probably going to wind up going. I use the strategy of, at least especially for the residential and using my windmills, I use as little roads as possible because there's not people walking around the field. So you want the least amount of roads as possible. So there's a pattern that we use. I think most of you are familiar with it. And I'll put most of my farmers on one side, most of my lumberjacks on the other side. I'll concentrate my gas up here. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the Dragon. Not really working with the auto cell. You actually still need gas. It does auto cell, but you need gas, which is sort of good for this strategy because I'm going heavy on the feed and I'm selling my excess feed. And like, there's no way express trucks can keep up with that because the Dragon cell stacks 25. And with me selling flour and wool and feed, like, I've been barely building my gas stock. Like, this has been all day. I get a little bit extra gas every now and again. This has been all day just to get up to 16 gas. So that means for express trucks, like the this gas setup would not be able to keep up with selling this much feed and selling tons and tons of feed, which is good because it keeps these feed troughs absolutely full. And I'd make a few bucks on the extra feed, right? Flour works in this arrangement pretty well with my rear wheat stand here. And then in this area, you don't get any of that wind blockage from any of the sheets. So, and then I've actually been putting quite a bit of these metals down, so they don't take so much money. I'm getting good money off of selling this feed, right? So it's like 8,500, I believe. And this is really great for starting out. Now, obviously, it's more advantageous to sell. Feed to your sheep and sell the wool. You get much more points, you get much more cash. But I would have done this much more efficiently. I would have expanded this out a little further, and then more meadows in here. Like I said, this is just only half-assed. I'm not really playing with this at all. I wasn't even going to bother, but seeing as how I've come this far with it, and I figured I'd try to pick up an Epic anyways, just to give that to the girlfriend's account, even though she could really care less to play. I have hopes, so we'll get into this again like a little bit at the end of the video. I do have hopes that maybe someday CounterStar will be something. I've pretty much given up on it at this point, but nevertheless, it's still there's still something there, at least anyways. It's still playable games, does have a player mechanic, even though it's pretty much broken, and it doesn't start doing anything with it, right? Like we know what needs to be done, right? What are we doing? What are the gems? Where's Jimmy? Anyways. So I think now typically my strategy, maybe I can show you here. I don't know if that's going to show up. I don't have a key for this, and I don't know if this is even showing up. So I apologize if that didn't show up. If it did, you can pause it. I'm not going to give you a key for it. That's what I was planning on building. Most of it's pretty self-explanatory. F is farm tractors, L's are loggers, R's are roads, WMs are windmills, SPs are strawberries. Pretty self-explanatory. That's what I was planning on building. Now it's based on my NFTs as well. I've got the graveyards up here and so forth. But yeah, I was going to put my Kilo gas setup around here. And eventually, if they did, if they did fix the dragon so I didn't need gas, I was just going to phase my gas setup out